All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for attending this bat Q&A this evening, and I hope you enjoyed the soothing sounds of some bat echolocation. We are here today from the DNR with two bat experts, our DNR bat mammalogists, Brad Westrich and Tim Shier. They are here to chat with us and answer all of your batty questions. So I hope everybody is excited. I know I am. I learn something every single time we do these Q&As. And we will get started here soon. Before we jump right into the batty goodness, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping things just to explain how Teams works in case anybody has not been on a Teams Live before. There are a lot of different platforms, so I know sometimes it might be a new experience for people. So for Teams Live, this event is live, running at a few second lag. So if we are a few seconds behind your questions, we will catch up to them. The event is being recorded, but we can't see you, we can't hear you. We can see your questions roll in, and it's being recorded so that at a later date we will put it on our YouTube account so folks can continue to learn about bat stuff in the future. As I mentioned, and as the title mentions, this is a Q&A, so please interact. Please put all of your bat questions in the Q&A at any point throughout the event, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. For any questions that we don't get to, we will send out an email after the event to everybody who registered with the question and the answer. So we'll still get to all the questions, even if there are a few we don't get to during the event, but we're going to do our best. Also, if anybody is needing this or wanting this, there is a closed caption setting in the settings section. So you should be able to navigate that in the toolbar on the top of your screen. That way, if you want subtitles, auto-generated subtitles, you can get those as well. So my name is Mariah Mason. I'm helping to produce today, and Adeline Ratcliffe is behind the scenes today helping with our Q&A. So thanks so much, Adeline. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Brad and Tim so they can introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about why we're talking about bats at this time of the year. Brad and Tim?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mariah, for the introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Brad Westrich. I'm the state mammologist with Indiana DNR.
And my name's Tim Shier. I am the assistant mammologist.
And together, with the assistance of many very generous donors to the Indiana Non-Game Wildlife Fund, we work across the state to monitor bat populations. And so in the winter months, that looks like getting into caves to count bats that are hibernating. And in the summer months, it involves a lot of running around with high frequency microphones on top of our vehicles, listening for bat calls.
Yeah, so what you saw at the beginning there, I think you maybe got to hear a few of our bat calls from local Indiana species of bats. That equipment that we used, it allows us to see and hear bat calls, which otherwise we would not be able to see or hear because it's a noise and it's at a frequency louder than we can normally hear. A lot of that equipment is purchased with funds that we get through donations through the Non-Game Wildlife Fund. So if you are listening and have donated, thank you very much. And we are always very grateful for any contributions people can make to that fund.
Yeah, and we wanted to talk to you guys today about bats and have one of these Q&As to follow up with one we had earlier this year in June. Right now is a very important time to talk about bats because you have a lot of young bats that are learning to fly. They're starting to migrate with some of the older individuals, but maybe they don't know where to go or they get tired quickly. And so they end up landing or roosting in places that are more easily seen by people. So oftentimes these bats are landing on people's houses or their window screens. And then they end up calling us to figure out, why is this bat here and should I be concerned? So we're here to answer those questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brad and Tim. I really appreciate it. And without further ado, we will go ahead and jump right into the questions from the audience. So it looks like we have a few in here. Again, please go ahead and publish any questions that you have at any time, and we'll get to those. But for now, we have some questions about recommendations for bat houses. Can you all tell us a little bit about how bat houses work and how folks can get information to install those, and just anything else you have about bat houses?
Yeah, so bat houses are a great way to provide alternative habitat to bats. A lot of times when they're most effective is when bats might be in a building and people evict them from a building. It gives them a new place to move into. A lot of bats will roost in dead tree snags out in the woods, and when those fall, they might need a new place to move into. And And sometimes bat houses even just become long-term permanent summer roosting habitat for bats as well. So in Indiana, we're at about that latitude where it's not too hot but not too cold. So typically bat houses should just be kind of a nice neutral color, probably not black because it'll get too hot. Probably not white because it might not get hot enough. Bat houses should be pretty warm. The heat helps the females especially produce and raise young. It helps with the development of young. The higher off the ground you can get a bat house, the better. Typically we say at least 10 to 12 feet, but higher is usually better. And usually an aspect facing kind of east to south, southeast, so that they can get some morning sunlight and warm up early in the day. That will help the bats be comfortable too. As far as the bat house itself, the more chambers, the larger it is usually going to be more effective than a small bat house with maybe only 1 or 2 chambers. The bats like to be able to move between different temperature gradients throughout the day and throughout the evening. So if you only have 1 chamber, it's probably going to be 1 temperature, and the bats aren't going to be happy a lot of the time and probably not move in or probably move out right away. But if you have a bat house with lots of chambers, that will offer a hotter one that's closer to the side that gets the sun, a cooler one farther back, and they can move and find that perfect temperature for their roosting during the day, for the raising of young, and for all their life cycle activities.
And so if you're seeing this picture of bats in a bat house, there's multiple chambers there. And this is what we mean when we're talking about like a larger bat house that has multiple chambers. If there's more of these little slats in there for bats to roost in between, they have a greater temperature gradient that they can go roost within. So they can move freely in between those chambers and get warmer if they want to, move to a cooler spot if they want to get cooler. And, you can find plans for building your own bat houses online. You can purchase some bat houses online as well. I've seen bat houses at some of my local hardware stores that unfortunately I wouldn't recommend to people just because they're so small. And if you have a bat house out there that's too small, it could potentially be a heat trap for bats. And so if they move into it and then we have a high heat event in the middle of the summer, it could actually kill those bats and push them past where their body can maintain a safe temperature. So when we say a bigger bat house is good, I'd say a nice medium size would be, starting off with something that's almost 2 feet tall and 1.5 feet wide, and then a couple of inches deep. That would give you something that's multiple chambered and safe enough for bats.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Brad. I had not heard that, some of the bat houses you might find readily available on the market or have easy access to might not be the best for bats. So I really appreciate that information. I knew I would learn something tonight, and there it is already within the first question. So let me see here. It looks like we have a question about environmental DNA cave air sampling. I don't know anything about this project, so I'll let you guys talk a little bit about it. I'm assuming it has something to do with conservation work that we're doing. So have there been any results from environmental DNA cave air sampling?
So there are no results on that project yet, but this is a new project that we're very excited about. Essentially, it involves putting a filter inside of the opening of a cave. You could put as many of you as you want in a single cave, but you put it up there for a day. Air naturally passes through that as the cave is expiring. And the idea is that skin cells that are sloughing off of bats are going to pass through those filters. You send those filters to a lab, they can figure out what DNA is on it, and they can narrow it down to a species. So for some of our really rare species of bats, like the northern long-eared bat, which is federally endangered and very difficult to find in a cave, we could use a method like this to find those guys out in the environment, even if we're not actually seeing them.
All right, well, that sounds super cool. Thank you so much for sharing about that project. And it looks like the next question that we have here has to do with white nose syndrome. So I know that's been a really hot topic for bats, and unfortunately for many years, or for several years now. So is white nose syndrome a concern here in Indiana? What species does it affect, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, great question. White nose, unfortunately, has made a big impact here in Indiana. It's a fungus that tends to thrive in a cave environment, which is unusual for a lot of fungi. They usually like hotter areas. But this particular fungus, it grows well in somewhat cooler environments in that constant cave temperature. And It likely came from Europe. It was first found in New York in 2006, I believe, and first found in Indiana in 2011, I think. And when it first came to Indiana, we started seeing some abnormal behaviors in our bats. They started flying outside in the wintertime when it was cold. Just started flying during the day, just some abnormal behaviors. And what the fungus does is it grows on their bodies. It's called white nose syndrome, but it actually grows all over their bodies, their wings, their faces, their muzzles. And it's like athlete's foot. So if a person gets athlete's foot, it's irritating, it annoys them. It's the same with bats and white nose syndrome. When they get the fungus growing on their bodies, it irritates them. It causes them to wake up during hibernation, burn through their fat reserves, start flying around looking for food in the middle of winter. And then a lot of times they end up starving to death or freezing to death outside, unfortunately. So we did, the first few years after white nose came to Indiana, we did see a number of our bat species decline anywhere from 50 to 90%, unfortunately. The bright side is it only affects cave hibernating bats. So about half our bats in Indiana are cave hibernating and the other half migrate in the wintertime. So the migratory bats are doing okay as far as white nose goes, but especially the tricolored bat and the little brown bat, if you're familiar with those species, have been hit really hard in caves. Recently, though, we have seen our numbers kind of bottom out and even start to tick up a tiny bit. So we're hopeful that we're slowly on our way to recovery. Unfortunately, bats don't reproduce very quickly. They're very long-lived, but they don't reproduce quickly. So it's a long process to rebuild a population when you've lost 90% of your species. But we've seen the worst of it here. Unfortunately, the disease is still passing through western states, Colorado, Montana, California, Washington, all out there. It's starting to pop up right now in different spots. And so they're kind of dealing right now with what we dealt with 7, 8, 9 years ago.
That's very depressing about the bat population decline and just that disease in general. However, I know that there's been a lot of good recovery efforts, and like you mentioned, it's a slow uptick, but the population hopefully will rebound. I know that we're doing a lot of work to support that. So, okay, so the next question I have here is one that we get quite a bit all through the summer, really, and I guess other times of year as well. What should we do about bats getting under the side of the eaves of houses or just into a house in general?
Yeah, you're right. That is a question we get quite often. Honestly, the best thing to do to start off with is just keep up with preventative maintenance on your house. And I get it, that can be tough with life getting in the way and things like that. But as you notice maybe soffits coming loose, or maybe your siding starting to pull away, or even gaps in the grout between bricks or other masonry on your house, just start to work on some of those, repair some of those entry points that bats could potentially use, because if bats don't get in there, then other wildlife might use that and chew larger holes there, which is something bats won't do. So prevention is key, and you can just do standard maintenance on your home to try to keep bats out. But once you get them there, evicting them safely is probably the safest method for you and bats moving forward. And there are some guides online on Bat Conservation International's webpage to sort of show you how to DIY it yourself if you are feeling handy and you want to get these bats out safely. There's also permitted wildlife controllers here in Indiana that will come out and do the work for you. And they will do it safely, and they will do it during times of year when the bats need protection. So they're going to avoid these times of year in the middle of summer when there are baby bats that are very sensitive and they need their moms around. So you can do preventative maintenance, and then you can do evictions to try to get them out during safe times of the year.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brad. I see that Adeline put a link to BatCon International's website on there, which has some of that information that you were mentioning and some of those eviction tips. Shame we can't just, send out an eviction notice. I don't know why the bats aren't getting with the program with that. Just kidding. But yeah, glad those resources are in there. It looks like the next question that we have today is what to do if someone encounters an injured bat, whether it's a baby bat or a large or an adult bat that's still alive but looks like it needs help. I think you mentioned like a rehabber of some kind. Where can we find information about that?
Yeah, so the first thing you maybe want to think about is the bat really injured or sick, or does it really need help? We talked a few minutes ago about bats moving across the landscape a lot right now. You might see them on the side of a building or the side of your house. I had a friend send me a message from Louisville last weekend saying they saw a bat just sitting on the edge of a building and they thought it might be sick or injured. And they sent a picture. It looked like it was probably fine, just resting on its way to its summer roosting habitat. Probably best to just leave it alone and let it be, as long as it's not in a place where it might come into contact with people or anything like that. If you do see a bat that's definitely sick or injured, if it's kind of flapping around oddly on the ground, or if it definitely has a broken wing or something like that, then wildlife rehabilitators are probably your first and best resource. If you Google Indiana DNR wildlife rehabilitators, it'll take you right to a link to go to our website of all the state approved nuisance wildlife, wildlife rehabilitators. It will list which ones deal with bats, which ones deal with other animals, where they're located. And you can give them a call and see if they can help out. Sometimes they might be able to come pick it up. Sometimes you might have to take it there. That's always probably your first best resource if you find a bat in need of care. You can always try to contact your local DNR office as well.
Yeah, and this time of year, I mentioned earlier that you have baby bats flying around. Maybe they get tired, they need to roost on a structure. You can also monitor them for a couple of days. And if they're still hanging out in the same spot, maybe give it 5 to 7 days, because they might be just going into something called torpor, which is essentially a light version of hibernation, where they're saving energy before they push off when the weather's suitable for them to fly. So maybe they're just resting for a long period of time. And so monitoring for a couple of days is always key. And if you find bats on the ground, not able to climb up trees or not trying to seek shelter in any way, those are bats that I definitely recommend, trying to get to a wildlife rehabilitator. Contact those wildlife rehabilitators first to see how you should proceed with obtaining the bat, so that you can get it safely to them, so that both you and the bat remain safe throughout that entire process.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brad. We've got kind of a fun one in here. Someone wants to know what your favorite species of bat is, and you were kind enough to share a really cool video with me before this presentation that shows bats just kind of exiting a cave. So while you're talking about your favorite species of bat, I will play that video for folks to see. Yeah, take it away.
Okay. I think my favorite Indiana species of bat is probably the tricolored bat. It is our smallest bat in the state. It's a hibernating bat. Wow. Unfortunately, as Tim mentioned, it's one of the species that got hit hardest by white nose syndrome, so we don't see them too often, but they are just cute as buttons, and I really love seeing them out in caves.
Yeah, and I've always kind of been fond of the eastern red bat. Eastern red bats, they're a migratory bat, so they don't hibernate in caves, but they can actually sometimes sort of weather the winter in leaf litter on the ground, sometimes even in Indiana. I've heard stories of people having controlled burns where red bats will fly up in front of the fire as they're trying to escape and flee the fire in, February, March, a month like that in Indiana. But the males can be a really pretty bright red color. They're not a big bat, middle-sized bat for Indiana, and they kind of have a fun little flittery flight pattern too, where they sort of bob up and down a lot. It's not real smooth or consistent. They kind of flutter around, and I think you can see a picture of an eastern red bat there. Really pretty dark wings and nice bright red color, and just a really, really cool looking bat, I think.
Awesome. Thank you both for indulging that. We had a little bit of tech issues with the video, but hopefully y'all were able to see that okay. So let's see here. It looks like our next question has to do with, other ways to help bats out. So you mentioned a couple of different times about how bat populations are in decline, and some things you can do include those bat houses like we talked about. But do you have any recommendations on how to be a good bat neighbor besides just providing a bat house?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the first things that you can do, and the easiest thing that you can do, is just be a good bat advocate. So spread positive messaging about bats. If you hear a friend or a family member, saying something really negative about bats, like they're a gross animal or they're just rats with wings, go ahead and break those myths and tell them something cool about what bats do, like how many insects they eat in a night, anywhere from 100 to 1,000 in a night, and that they're eating things like mosquitoes to beetles that could be eating our crops that we grow here in Indiana. So they're providing these free pest services. In addition to that, if you have the capacity to do it, whether it's a pot you could plant something in, or you have a field you could grow something in, planting native plants so you can draw in native insects that bats will eat at night is always a good idea to help bats too.
Yeah, and just minimizing and eliminating any pesticides or herbicides you use around the house is a simple thing to do. You don't have to do anything at all. Just don't use pesticides and herbicides. Those chemicals get into the water and into the food chain, and bats drink the water and eat the food, and that can affect their health as well. And if you have any just big old trees on your property or dead snags that have lots of loose peeling bark, some species of bat really like to roost up underneath the bark of dead trees, or like shagbark hickories, trees like that. That's a great habitat for some of our species in the summer. So as long as it's not a dead tree that's about to fall on your house or anything like that, as long as it's not a safety concern, it's great to just leave those trees there and let them serve as wildlife habitat.
Awesome, great tips. Sounds like a lot of the things that we would do for for many different species would help bats and help other species, just kind of healthy things for all, which is great.
Definitely.
Cool. So we have time for just a couple more questions here today. And like I mentioned before, anything we don't get to today, we will send out in an email to everybody who registered. So you'll still get questions answered if we don't get to them. But we have a question here about migration. So you've talked a couple times about how some bats hibernate and winter in caves, some bats migrate. What are the migration windows for bats? Is that the same for all species, or just kind of what does that yearly cycle look like?
Yeah, I would say that the migratory bats, maybe the cycles differ by species, and when it happens, it might change year to year because they're likely going based on wind currents and temperatures in the local area, as well as available insects. But typically, you might see migratory bats coming through Indiana in the fall, right around October through November at the latest, coming through on their way further south. And they're making the same distance migratory patterns that, birds and some of these larger insects like monarch butterflies are doing too. And then in the spring, they're going to be coming back a little bit earlier than our hibernating bats are coming out of caves. So you might see these migratory bats coming back into Indiana, maybe in February, as soon as it's starting to get warm. Something interesting we've been noticing in other states too is that as climate change is warming our climates, maybe we're having like milder winters, some of these bats and other migratory species are coming back to the northern latitudes earlier, which could cause a mismatch with their prey species because maybe the trees haven't leafed out yet and the insects aren't there. And so we're starting to run into issues where maybe these bats are coming back and they don't have the necessary food resources that they need. But that's something that we'll learn more about through time.
Yes, that's super interesting. I hadn't thought about that. If they're hibernating more quickly and some of the things they need and rely on to survive on aren't here yet. So it looks like somebody in the chat or in the question and answer is wanting to know if there are any good places to go see bats in Indiana. What do you recommend for folks who want to see bats, and what do you recommend not to do to make sure that if we see them, we're doing so in a way that protects them?
Yeah, so in the summertime, there aren't actually a whole lot of bats in caves or abandoned mines. There might be some, but they're not hibernating right now. They're out on the landscape. So in caves, there's a lot of safety issues with caves and access to. So I wouldn't try to go just find your nearest cave and go diving in and try to find bats that way. There are definitely cave tours you can go on to maybe see some bats in caves like that. But really just going outside, little after sunset. We were around the Bloomington area, and I like to go down to the Lake Monroe area where there is a lot of water and a lot of trees and bugs out at night usually, and a lot of good habitat for bats. And usually this time of year, I can see quite a few bats just flying around the lake a little bit after sunset time. Any kind of good habitat areas like that, wetlands, lakes, riparian areas, it's a great place to just go hang out at in the evening, a little after sunset, and look up into the sky and see what you see. I know if you're around the Indy area, there's a Sodalis Nature Park by the airport where there are actually quite a few bat houses that have been part of an Indiana State University research project. And I believe some of those bat houses at least are used by bats, and you might be able to see bats flying out of those bat houses in the evening time if you go to that park. There are probably some other parks around the state too that have bat houses as well. Sometimes barns are great summer habitat for bats as well. So you might have some farmland around you or some neighbors with barns that can tell you about bats they see in their barns, and you might be able to see them fly out in the evening time as well.
I will say that if you're feeling adventurous, you can definitely go down to Wyandotte Cave between Memorial Day and Labor Day. And on the weekends, they offer tours of that cave so that you can go in there and see how important it is historically for Indiana, as well as for bats. It's actively used by Indiana bats as well as gray bats, both of which are federally endangered species.
And gray bats are a species that will use caves year-round. So we don't have most of our gray bats that we know about are in the southern reaches of the state, kind of along the Ohio River. But gray bats will be in caves year-round, unlike most of our species.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. Sounds like there are definitely some opportunities to at least possibly have the chance to safely view bats, safe for you and safe for them. We've got another question in here that has to do with pollination. So you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but someone says that they've heard that bats are pollinators. Are there any plants in Indiana that bats pollinate? So you mentioned planting native plants, but are there any specific ones that are better or worse for bats?
Yeah, good question. So there wouldn't be any pollinating bats here in Indiana. You'll find those more in desert ecoregions or even the tropics around the world. Here in Indiana, we just have insect-eating bats. And in terms of what native plants you could plant that would attract insects that bats could forage on the best, I'm not sure if I have any good recommendations on that. Honestly, anything native you plant that's going to either have night blooming flowers would be good, because insects are going to be flying in to pollinate that, and the bats may eat those pollinators. But any native plants are going to be great because they're going to be having their own host of insects that might be eating the leaves during the day, flying around or hatching out of there at night that the bats could then eat.
All right, excellent. Thank you for that distinction. I had my pollinators versus insect eaters cross with reference to why the native plants were good for them. And thank you so much for clearing that up. So it looks like that is all of the time we have, unfortunately, tonight for the Bat Q&A, but I feel like I learned a lot. I definitely was taking notes and, caught a few things that we hadn't come up in past events. So thank you so much to everybody who took the time out to participate this evening and to enjoy the Q&A. I hope everybody else learned something like I did. And thanks a ton to Adeline, Brad, and Tim, all of you for your time being on here and answering batty questions for everybody. And I will catch everybody next time. Look out for that email that'll have the answer to any questions that we haven't gotten to so far. That'll be coming within the next few days. So thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you.